I guess for the listeners too, to add some context. So I was renting in Sydney in a pretty middle class area, 2-bedroom apartment for about, I think it was like $550 a week or something in that ballpark. I don't know if that hurts your Western Australian pockets, Dave. I'm not sure if $550 for a 2-bedroom apartment's expensive over there.
Yeah, that would be fairly up there for a 2-bedroom apartment, unless you're in a pretty decent suburb close to the city, I would say.
Yeah. So it was an old brick, like probably 60s, 70s building. And I'd saved up a bunch of money. I hadn't really, I'd just been saving money for quite a few years now, particularly with the higher savings rates. And it just got me thinking about, I wonder if it's the right time to buy a house. The things that prompted me for it personally were having avoided it previously, because we've talked in previous episodes about I thought home ownership sounded stressful. I kind of started off thinking, well, the mortgage on a place I could afford with this money seems to be about the same as rent. It was kind of a quick, back of the envelope thing. It was like, well, I'm going to pay $30K a year in rent, or I'm going to pay $30K a year on mortgage interest. And then I thought, well, I wonder which one's better. And I thought about some of the assumptions and problems. Like I thought, well, interest rates are going to come down, probably, is, my read of the situation eventually. And so it's not going to get worse. So that interest number's probably only going to get better, but rents aren't going to suddenly start coming down, by like massive amounts either. So I thought, well, maybe there's some interesting future cheapness in the home ownership. But then as I started to look for homes, and I'm not an expert here to people listening, like I didn't know what strata was 12 months ago by any stretch. So then I start noticing strata fees and all the water and rates and stuff like that. And I thought, damn, some of these are quite a lot. In some cases, they were like half of what I was paying in rent anyway. And then I was like, man, I'm going to buy a house just to pay a mortgage and half of my rent. So I wanted that to be kind of taken into account too. So that was like another thing I looked at. And then I also was like, well, buying a house, if I know ETFs go up, sure. But if I bought a house, or when I say house, I mean apartment. If I bought an apartment today and I tried to sell it in 10 years for the same amount, will I be better off? And the answer is absolutely no. So there was these elements around what do I think is going to happen with ETFs, what I think is going to happen with housing in terms of the price changes. And the last one, Dave, amidst my little ramble here for you, was stamp duty. Because in New South Wales as a first homeowner, if I bought an apartment under 800K, I wouldn't have to pay stamp duty. Whereas if I bought a bigger place, I would have to pay stamp duty. And then it's like, I got my parents in my ear being like, buy a house, got to get some land kind of thing. Is it better off just, biting the bullet, leveraging myself out to the max to buy a big plot of land, paying a crap ton in stamp duty, and will I turn out better? Or should I just buy, a little apartment and just kind of be happy with it? And which one just puts me out better financially in the end? They were the things floating through my mind when I was thinking about the decision.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And I think it paints a nice picture for people listening around how you were going about making that decision. So I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned there with the expenses and how they add up on top of the mortgage. So I think that's one thing that people often forget about, because I think quite often when people are debating whether to rent or buy and whether it's the right time, they look at how much they're paying in rent and they compare it to what they would be paying if they had a mortgage. And so that's when they start this comparison, which makes sense. And you probably remember a few years ago, Hayden, when interest rates dropped super low, it was cheaper to buy a home, like cash flow wise, than it was to rent. Do you remember that period?
Yeah, I didn't have a lot of money then, so I was just sad that my savings account went down. But I do remember the period. My elder property manager, Dave.
Yeah, so that was a very interesting period, and I think that's kind of thrown people off a little bit, because that was quite unusual in terms of the cash flow outcome and how low interest rates got. So majority of the time, for the majority of property types, renting tends to be a decent bit cheaper, and sometimes that's because of interest rates like now, but other times it's also because of the principal repayments, which obviously come on top of the interest that you have to pay, but then also the ongoing costs associated with holding that property. So I often find that those other costs like water rates, council rates, insurance, strata fees, like you said, Hayden, and repairs and maintenance, I often find that they're like roughly 1% of like the property value per year, sometimes more depending on the property. So if you add that to an average rental yield right now, which might be something like 4%, compare it to an average rental yield. You take so this is my simpleton math, right? This is how I think about these things, Hayden. So I look at the mortgage rate, which is roughly 6.5% at the moment, and then add the ownership costs, which might be another 1%. So already you've got like 7 to 7.5% right now. That's kind of if you finance the whole lot, ignoring, stamp duty and all that. And then you compare that to what rental yields are. Rental yields across capital cities are averaging something like 4%. So that's a pretty decent difference in price. It's more than 3% of the property value per year to own versus to rent. a particular property. So that's quite a lot. So yeah, that's the first kind of simple way that I would look at it, and that's how people tend to start coming up with this idea of buying a home when it's comparable to what they're paying in rent.